but the Carve from Brindlewood system adds a lot on top of that.
Try to turn it into a D&D encounter or something.
Hey, let me in on that.
You are not allowed, either in or out of character, to talk about your character's past. We're going to be crowdfunding 3 books.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Infinite Tavern podcast. We are your favorite host. I, Amaan, HK. I humbly swear. Never mind.
Your ever humble Anorak, or Raghav, as he's known in the common world.
And we always talk about D&D. We both love D&D, although I moved away from D&D recently over to D&D TTRPGs, and we've had some guests who are lovers, enjoyers, writers, designers of indie TTRPGs, and very similarly we have one for you from the designer from the amazing Brindlewood Bay to the now upcoming the Between Kickstarter. We have Mr. Jason Cordova. Hello.
It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely lovely to have you here. It's been on my mind ever since your collaboration with the Pigeon Killers. Shout out to the Pigeon Killers, by the way. Shout out to Kumi and everyone. Ever since you did your breakdown for how to play Brindlewood Bay, and then you did your one shot or two shot, it was. I was really intrigued because I had never seen something like that. All of you playing middle-aged women trying to solve a crime.
Right, yeah.
I'm like, hey, let me in on that. I want to be in on that. So that was my first introduction to Brindlewood Bay itself. I've seen people talk about Brindlewood Bay, on the Twitters, on the Instagrams, heard about it from a lot of different people. But here I want to talk to you about how did everything start. I don't mean the game. I mean, how did you start in the TTRPG space itself? What was that journey like for you?
Oh my goodness. Well, if we're going to go back to the beginning.
The very beginning.
The very beginning. Yeah, I'll give you the very beginning. I first started playing tabletop role-playing games when I was 10 years old. This would have been, oh my goodness, I'll just say my age. Why not? That would have been 36 years ago. So when I was 10, I started playing. My father used to take me to this comic book and game store in Oceanside, California. And there was this copy of the Marvel Superheroes role-playing game. There was like a box set they used to sell for the Marvel Superheroes game. And I didn't know what it was. I had no frame of reference for what a tabletop role-playing game was. I didn't know what Dungeons and Dragons was. I had no frame of reference. I just knew that it was some sort of game that lets you play Marvel superheroes, and that was very important to me when I was 10 years old. So I convinced him to get it for me, and I read those books that were in that box probably 3 or 4 times, and I still never really got it. Like, I didn't quite understand what was going on. But then, happily, an older kid came over, and that kid had played Dungeons and Dragons, and so understood kind of the form, and taught me how to do it. And I'll never forget, I remember the very first session of a role-playing game I played when I was 10 years old. This older kid, who was probably like 14 or 15 years old, I've made my character. My character was a villain. I was going to rob a jewelry store. It was nighttime. The jewelry store is locked up. And he says, okay, you're standing in front of this jewelry store. What do you do? And I remember feeling at that time, I can still distinctly recall that time of like how I felt. Like, what do you mean? What do I do? Like, I don't understand. Like, what are you saying? Like, what do you mean? What do I do? Like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And
I have my own agency.
Yeah. Like, I couldn't even comprehend it. And he said, just like, think about it. Like, what do you do? Like, if you were this character, what do you do? And I was like, well, I guess I checked to see if the door is unlocked. And then he told me, okay, you do that and this happens. And I remember that was such a big light bulb moment for me, right? I was like, whoa, like this feels so like the possibilities are amazing, right? Like, and it just really, really spoke to me. And I've had a love affair with role-playing games ever since. I mean, I played all through my schooling and a little bit into like, college and such. And I kind of took a little break in the early aughts and I was playing board games instead of role-playing games. But I came back to role-playing games in 2013 because of all of the sort of like indie tabletop role-playing games. Like the indie scene was kind of drew me back to the hobby. And so pretty much since 2013, I've been getting more and more professionally involved in the space. I have my own podcast that I co-host, and I got into publishing around 2017 or 2018 or so, somewhere around there. And yeah, we've in my company, The Gauntlet, we've started publishing standalone games. Brindlewood Bay is probably our biggest game of all the ones we've published, but we've had a few decent hits, and it's just full steam ahead at this point, right? Like it's if you had asked 10-year-old me, or if you had told 10-year-old me, hey, you're going to be like publishing and making role-playing games someday, I would have absolutely believed you. I would have said, yes, I know that. I'm obviously going to be doing that, right? But I think like as I got older, it just felt like more of a hobby. I never would have thought that I would eventually be doing it as a job, So it's still very cool, and even now, like as deep in it as I am, I'm still very surprised every day when because I get to wake up and just do role-playing games as a job. So
yeah, I mean, one of the things that still draws me into role-playing games is that even though I wasn't into role, I mean, most of the players currently in India got into role-playing games in the past 7 or 8 years maximum.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So because again, we didn't have that kind of exposure that was very centralized towards the West. So, and it sort of awakens something in us, that sort of creativity that's always in ourselves as we are growing up, but that sort of dies away as we need to grow up, have more responsibilities, study, work, all of that.
Yeah.
And this is just our way to have that sort of not just work but fun as well. It's a fun thing that we can all do. We have a shared fun experience, much like telling a story around a campfire or hanging out with friends.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what it's like. It's sort of, I always consider role-playing games at their best. They are a sort of, they're sort of like just a sort of formalization of something that we all do really well as human beings anyway. Like we're very, very good storytellers. It's sort of natural to our species, right? To like tell stories to each other. And whether it be like campfire ghost stories or, whatever, right? Like, mythology, folklore, whatever. We're very, very good at telling stories, and role-playing games just finds a way of adding some rules to that so that you can kind of go into all kinds of different places, like places in storytelling you might not be able to do otherwise. And so it's a really, really terrific time to be involved in this hobby. I didn't actually know that role-playing games were so relatively recent to India. So that's actually really cool to know. It kind of, it's exciting, right? It's exciting because it's like, there's so much possibility there, right? Like, so that's super cool.
Yeah, it's been relatively very recent that people started getting into D&D. It's, I mean, the explosion was right during the COVID lockdown. So people were locked at home, so they needed to find a way to interact with each other. So I think D&D provided a proper, a platform for them to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And campaign 3 of Critical Role was also coming out at the same time.
Yeah, it was huge. Yeah.
So that plus people were binging on shows a lot. So we had the Big Bang Theories, the Community. I even heard that there was an episode on iZombie which dealt with D&D, but I'm not sure. I hadn't watched iZombie at that point.
There was a few years where every show had to have like a D&D thing, I would say in the States, I mean, role-playing games have always been kind of like it's been like a roller coaster. Like there's been peaks and valleys. They were very, very big in the late 70s and early 80s, and then they kind of dipped, came back a little bit in the mid 90s, and then kind of dipped, and then really I would say the current like boom is almost entirely owed to Stranger Things and Critical Role. Like those are the two big things, right? Stranger Things happened, and then Critical Role happened, and now it's like it's great. I mean, they've been so. When you have like so many people like suddenly interested in your hobby and in your industry, it creates so many like terrific opportunities, right? I mean, and even if it's not something you do as a business like I do, even if it's just something you do as a hobbyist, or you just do it because you love it and you're passionate about it, it's fun that like there's so many people willing to engage,
Oh yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned that in the knots, you were more rather into board gaming than
Yes.
role-playing game. So when you sort of shifted back into the TTRPG space as you got into publishing, writing, designing, was there anything that you took away from your time, being super into board games?
Oh, what a good question. It's a great question. And it actually explains it really well, because the thing that I was sort of loving about board games at that time, and at that time it would have been for me, it was like board games that were being published mostly in Europe, like German board games and family strategy games and things like that. What I loved about those board games is that there was the rules were very precise, right? Like there's no fudging those games, right? Like they are very like precision in their rules and and how they're balanced, and sort of how you use rules to sort of to convey certain types of thing in the game, right? And so I was really drawn to this idea of like just like kind of what I consider to be like really high level game design, right? And so the thing that drew me back to role playing games, and in the indie RPG space especially, is this idea that in indie RPGs you had these rule sets that were very specific. Like this is a very specific rule set designed to tell a really particular type of story, and that's all this rule set does, right? Like you play this game, like there's a really terrific game called My Life with Master, where you play these, by Paul Sega, where you play these sort of like servants of this Dr. Frankenstein style character. And that game is so interesting because the rules of that game are like created in the lab, so to speak, to just do this one story, right? You cannot use those rules to do any other story. They only do this one story, this story of these servants of this villainous, master character who they have to eventually overthrow, right? And that was a real like eye opener for me, because I began to see role playing games in a different way. Like rather than wanting a more universal system that can do all kinds of things, I was really attracted to this idea of smaller focused systems that told really specific laser sharp kind of things, right? Laser sharp stories. And so, yeah, there's a connection there, right? There was definitely a connection there. I was drawn to like, it was design that kind of drew me back, I guess.
Yeah. What you said also kind of harkens me back to an opinion I saw on Twitter, of all places, because that place can be a mess.
A bit.
And somebody said that it shouldn't be that one system should provide for you everything that you are able to do in that world. The systems are specific, that it should give you a feel of the genre that you are playing in.
Sure. Yeah.
Like similarly with D&D, it's more like it's heroic fantasy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Same with Pathfinder. And when we come to, for example, let's say Brindlewood Bay or The Between, we really get to feel, okay, this is the environment we are playing in. We really don't need a system, like we don't need the SRD or any things like that to, accompany our gameplay. What the system that we have over here is itself enough to facilitate that gameplay in itself.
Exactly.
We don't need a perception roll or things like that.
Right, yeah.
So that actually brings me to the point of why Powered by the Apocalypse as one of the systems that you're using. Through correct me if I'm wrong, but does Brindlewood Bay also use Powered by the Apocalypse? I haven't played Brindlewood Bay, so I can't
Yeah.
recall that.
Well, so Powered by the Apocalypse is interesting. I actually, so our games, which are apart from a game that we publish called Trophy, our games are what we call carved from Brindlewood, meaning they use a lot of the principles and ideas of Brindlewood Bay, right? So you have Brindlewood Bay, you have The Between, which we're getting ready to do crowdfunding on. We have Public Access, the Silt versus role playing game, several others, and you're correct that they have like Powered by the Apocalypse as a sort of chassis underneath them, like the sort of basic conflict resolution and die rolls are PBTA, but we don't really consider them PBTA as such because they kind of do their own thing, right? But that said, I like Powered by the Apocalypse games because they emulate genre, right? Like that's such an important thing that they do. I mean, there's lots of reasons to like Apocalypse World and games based off of it, but one of the things that those games do really well is they emulate genre really well, and they have they have what I would say is a more cinematic approach to the gameplay. In those games, when you pick up dice and roll dice, you are doing it to resolve a whole scene, right? Like you're going to resolve a whole scene with that one die roll, and you're going to narrate that whole scene, as opposed to rolling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth to like hit, the dragon or whatever, right? So it's a slightly like, the emphasis is much more on like kind of narration and using the dice to just kind of arbitrate like, bigger pieces of fiction, right? And so that was, mostly Brindlewood Bay and The Between have Powered by the Apocalypse as their sort of chassis, just because that's the kind of games that we were playing in the Gauntlet, which is the publishing company and community group that I run. And so the Gauntlet was very much into Powered by the Apocalypse games. I mean, we made a big reason why Powered by the Apocalypse became like a thing in the hobby, right? Because we were advocating for it so strongly. We had podcasts and all kinds of stuff about it, right? So that was like in our DNA, right? And so, yeah, we naturally took all that and put it into Brindlewood Bay and The Between, or the parts that were most helpful. But I actually think that you could take some of the narrative tech and some of the mystery and investigation tech, and the sort of collaborative storytelling tech that is quite unique to Carved from Brindlewood games. I think you could actually take that and apply it to all sorts of games. Like you could very easily apply some of this stuff to Dungeons and Dragons and make a sort of investigation focused Dungeons and Dragons session, right? You could absolutely take some of the techniques and stuff from these games and put them into other rule systems, and it wouldn't be too difficult. And so, yeah, our games have a PBTA base because that's what we like, but there's no reason why it has to be, I wouldn't say.
That's great to hear, especially that you mentioned that, hey, you can take these these mechanics from a completely different system and have it apply to a session, or for example, one half of a session even, and have something crazy going on for the player, something for them to enjoy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
And another thing that you mentioned about genre and the PBTA being cinematic is that literally both of these games, Brindlewood Bay and The Between, like Brindlewood Bay, it's there in the summary itself. Murder, She Wrote,
yeah,
Lovecraftian,
right? Yeah.
So where are these inspirations coming from, and what kind of media do you consume, and how do you consume it that you are able to think of, what, this would make a really fun system?
Yeah. I had to ask, first of all, I just like, because I'm totally curious, like, do they have Murder, She Wrote in India? Is that a thing? Like, do they like air it anywhere in India? Or they have something like it?
I don't think they air it.
Think so,
No.
Okay. Well, if there are any Indian listeners who've never seen it, you should check it out. It's a great show. But yeah, it's a great question. For me, it's really kind of like, I guess, like, to some degree, I'm just sort of a I don't know. I see a thing that I like, and my brain thinks, okay, how can I make a role playing game out of this? Right? Like, what could we do to make a role playing game out of this? And so that's where the Between came from, because there's this show called Penny Dreadful, which I watched Penny Dreadful, love Penny Dreadful, most of it anyway, not all of it, and I was like, I want to make the Penny Dreadful role-playing game. There's not a role-playing game that does Penny Dreadful, and so I'm going to do that. And so that's where the idea for the Between came from. Now, when I did my research for the Between, I started to like work in other influences and inspirations, you know, particularly like British horror classic novels and things like that, right? But initially, yeah, it was just this kind of like, oh yeah, I really love this, I'm going to do this. And so that's a lot of like what propels me. I read a lot. I read probably 70 or 80 books a year. I'm constantly like thinking of things of like, I bet I could put that in a game somehow, or I bet I could like make this a character in a game. I could kind of play with this idea a little bit. So I'm always sort of like, I've always got just like the things I'm reading and watching, like kind of swimming around in my head. For Brindlewood Bay, it was this really particular, that was actually a really interesting kind of outcome, because I didn't start, like Brindlewood Bay was not an accident, but it was an accident, because I was originally writing The Between first. The Between is the game about monster hunters in Victorian era London, right? And I knew I wanted to create this sort of unique mystery solving investigation system, right? And I was trying to do something that hadn't really been done before, and I wasn't sure if it was going to work. And The Between, I'd already written a lot of playbooks, and I'd written a lot of like scenarios and stuff. And so in order to test out the mystery system of The Between, I wanted to make a smaller game that I could kind of like use as a sketch almost, right? Like, so if it didn't work in the smaller game, I would know it wouldn't work in the bigger game, and I wouldn't have to keep redoing the bigger game, you know? And so that's where Brindlewood Bay came from. It was somebody, I was like, hey, I want to make a smaller mystery game. Like, what should it be about? And someone on Twitter was like, I don't think there's like a Murder, She Wrote style game. And I was like, you know what? I don't think there is. I love Murder, She Wrote. And so, and then someone else was like, you know, it'd be really cool if it was like Murder, She Wrote, but H.P. Lovecraft. And I was like, that would be cool. And so that was kind of how that came about. And I was like, that is a great idea. And so I kind of, you know, went back, did some research, and watched a lot of Murder, She Wrote. And then I kind of started to think about, I mean, I was really just trying to test out this idea for the mysteries that I wanted to do in The Between, but I actually really got into, you know, the setting of Brindlewood Bay as well, as it was kind of coming together in my mind. And so it was, and then ultimately Brindlewood Bay was received really well. People loved it. And so it became kind of its own thing. But initially, yeah, it was just like a trial thing for The Between. So I was just trying stuff out, but it was a happy accident, basically. Yeah.
Oops, all grandmas, but make it
exactly, yeah. Exactly right, yeah.
70 to 80 books. I struggle to finish 10 books in a year, so that is a lot.
Yeah, I read every moment. Like if I have a moment, I will pick up my Kindle or whatever, or if I'm reading a physical book, I'll have it in hand, and I'll be reading. So yeah.
Being an English major, I used to read a lot of books back in college. But when real life hit, it hit me like a ton of bricks. It hit me like a speeding truck. And I almost didn't read a book entirely for 1 year. Then I said, hey, you're doing something wrong, buddy.
I went through that too. Yeah, I went through that too, because I went to law school, and law school like beat the desire to read out of me really badly. Like I didn't want the last thing I wanted to do was read, right? Anything, like for pleasure or not. Like I just did not want to read anymore. And so probably for several years after law school, I didn't read regularly. And then I kind of like got back into it, and I was like, oh yeah, I really like reading. Reading is cool. So yeah.
One of my favorite filmmakers, I don't know if you've heard his name, Werner Herzog.
Oh sure. Yeah.
So he's one of my favorite filmmakers. He's completely mad, but he's still one of my favorite filmmakers. And somebody asked him, you know, what's the key to making a good film? And he just said 17 times in a row, he said, read. And that's all he said. And I'm like, yeah, I'm going to take this madman's word to heart.
I will say, if you're a fan of Werner Herzog, you'll almost certainly have heard of or watched Aguirre the Wrath of God, right?
Oh
And
yeah,
Aguirre the Wrath of God, if you want a role-playing game that does Aguirre the Wrath of God style stories, our game Trophy is so made for that. It is the Aguirre the Wrath of God role-playing game. So not in the setting, but in the themes and the tone. It is
I
very much
love
that. Yeah.
I love that movie, and I'll check this out. And to anyone who's listening, please watch Aguirre Wrath of God. It's next level.
It's a
And
thing.
people should know the behind the scenes as well.
Yeah.
You know,
It is. I read about that and I think no matter how bad or hard any of the things we do are, it will never match Gary the Wrath of God.
Yeah.
It'll never match it.
Oh, or even Fitzcarraldo for that matter.
Indeed.
If you have seen that. You specifically mentioned, and that my mind immediately went to Raghav. Like, hey, if I'm consuming a media, I imagine how can this be made into a system or thing, and that's what he does as well.
I mean, it's not for a system, but I just try to turn it into a D&D encounter or something. So if I'm watching a movie, I just try see how I can just turn that into an encounter for one of my campaigns. So
I feel that completely, Raghav. I made what I'm pretty sure is still available on the Dungeon World website, the first Sharknado Dungeon World monster.
What?
I was like, oh, I'm making a Dungeon World monster of Sharknado, and I'm pretty sure you can still go download that. So yeah,
I was watching an informative some video on YouTube about a non-Newtonian fluid. It's called like you hit it too hard, it's hard as a rock. If you just touch it, it acts as a liquid. I turned that into an ooze monster in D&D.
Nice. Yes.
So
love it.
if you roll between 17 and 20, that is the only time you can damage it. Roll below 17, your sword just goes right through it. It doesn't do any damage. Roll higher than 20, it just feels like you're hitting rock and you take force damage in that.
Nice. And what I love about that is I think that's where I always like to say that like being a game master is it's the same as being a game designer. They're very, very similar and skills like they're kind of the same thing in a lot of ways, because anytime you are writing something for your home game or anytime you are creating something for your table, you're engaging in game design, right? And like that's how I got started, right? Like I would also like write little encounters. Like I would write encounters that were inspired by things. I was like, oh, this would be so cool. As a, I was playing Dungeon World a lot back in the 2013, 2014 kind of time frame, and that was kind of what got me into that side of it. I was like, you know what? The next thing to do is to write a scenario or to write a dungeon. And then the next thing now the next thing to do is to go ahead and let's just do a whole game. Right. So yeah, that's how you go down that path. So, yeah.
I basically made the Fremen or the Aiel culture from the Wheel of Time, literally transported them into my Dolmenwood game. So it's basically, what if the Fremen or the Aiel from the Wheel of Time, what if they get transported into, a medieval fairy tale fantasy kind of setting? What if they get, what will that happen? How will that work out? So, that's just, it just sparked a question in my mind, like, what if this, but in this?
But that's why this hobby is so cool, right? Like that's what makes this hobby like so cool. Like I feel like role-playing games are at their best as a hobby, as a community, when we're doing this kind of thing, right? Like when we're sort of that's why I really love our Discord server in the Gauntlet. Our server is very focused on the games that we publish, but within that space, though, people are doing their own thing, like they're making their own versions of Carved from Brindlewood games. They're making their own, mysteries for Brindlewood Bay or the Between. They're doing their own thing. And that conversation and that sort of organic, like creation, that creative sort of community is so, I love it. Like it really, really like fuels me. Like it makes me want to get up and do this every day, like I get so into that. So that's super cool.
Yeah, that's what we keep saying. Like we have this whole motto that we keep saying that we love our community. If you look at any D&D community, people collaborate with. There's I don't see any gatekeeping around here. It doesn't. People are sweet. People are nice. They help each other. Collaborate on stories. We have
Yeah.
people just talking about a simple mechanic just to make it better, and that is
Yeah.
just the best thing about this community.
It's I love to hear that. Like I think that there was a period in role playing games, maybe, I don't know, like I would say it kind of, we have little flashpoints in it, but right now we're in a good spot. But there have been times in the past where people have like really drawn a line in the sand and like gotten and really kind of like crystallized like this is what a role playing game is, and you people over here are doing it wrong, and this is the right way. And you kind of have these like little moments where people are very like in their own camps. But I feel like right now we're in a really good space right now as a broader hobby where people are taking from all kinds of inspirations, right? Like I have a podcast about the OSR and old school adventure modules called Fear of a Black Dragon, and I don't really consider myself a so-called member of the OSR. I don't create OSR content, and I don't even play OSR games, but I love OSR adventures, and I love those modules, and I like to read them, and I like to run them in the games that I prefer. And it's and I can see, like, even though the OSR is not my thing, I can see the value in what's going on in that space. And I can kind of learn some things from it and take some things from it and apply it to the stuff that I'm doing. And I would like to think that other people, can kind of take and, story game or indie RPG ideas and put it in their fantasy games, in their D&D games, whatever. Right. And so I feel like we're in a really good space right now as far as that goes. Everybody is kind of sort of having a more expansive view of what the hobby is and kind of how to incorporate stuff into their game. I think it's really great.
You mentioned a term that I've heard very recently, story game.
Yeah.
So what do you think exactly makes up a story game? And do you consider the between kind of a story game as well?
Yeah. That's a hard question. I mean, I guess I say story game in the way that it was. Okay, so the history of it, I would say, is back in the early 2000s. There was this forum called The Forge, right? And The Forge was doing a lot of really interesting things in terms of role-playing games. There were the people who were kind of on the Forge forums, they were creating and talking about games, role-playing games, in a way that nobody else was. They were creating these much more narrative focused games, and that kind of came to be known as story games, right? Like that came to be the name of them. Probably like the most salient examples that people might know if you don't otherwise play them would be Fiasco by Jason Morningstar. A lot of people consider Apocalypse World to be a story game. I question that. Or things like what are some of the other big story games? Like Dogs in the Vineyard. There's some others, but in any case, it was this whole like kind of design movement. It sort of stopped being a specific design movement when the Forge closed down, and then the group of people who we now call the Forge diaspora, they sort of went out and they were sort of creating their own things in different spaces, and that's kind of where Apocalypse World comes from. That's sort of where a lot of the stuff that Evil Hat publishes came from, right? All that sort of that kind of time period, right? And so story games were often like pitted against old school role playing games in a very negative way. Like basically, you had some bad actors who were kind of dissing each other basically about it, and the Gauntlet was never part of that. Like we always had kind of a story game and indie RPG focus, but we sort of came after all of that, and so we started to like kind of look at the hobby as like, okay, story games and OSR they're very similar in a lot of ways, and so let's celebrate the similarities rather than like how they're different. So yeah, this idea of story game, it's kind of a nebulous definition if I'm being honest. There are many people who would look at Brindlewood Bay and The Between and say that's a story game. I don't know if I do. I think I consider them. I don't know. They're just role playing games to me. I guess I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know if like story game is what I would like call them. They certainly have a lot of design influences from the story game movement, though. They certainly have a lot of those influences, right? Although I wouldn't necessarily call them story games. I think story games are usually a little bit more. They usually are more like one shots or one and done type games, like Dread or 10 Candles, right? You just play them once and the story is done. Our games can be played over the many sessions, right? So,
yeah. And shout out to Wes, who recently DM'd us on the Pigeon Killers.
Oh,
who ran the Between. Amazing GM.
Wes is great. Love Wes. Yeah.
And interesting thing, we playtested the Between was, what do you feel what's going to be the negative consequence of your action, and putting that on the player, like, oh shit, what if this thing goes wrong, what will happen? I have to think about it, not the DM. And as a GM, that was a weight off of my shoulders, let me tell you. And then Wes said, I was rolling for something, and Wes said, okay, what's the negative consequence for it? And I said something, and Wes said, always does this is it's actually worse than that.
It's worse than that, yeah.
And then just takes that and adds on to it. And that was such a nice moment of collaboration that both of us had. Like, hell yeah, that's what I want more of. That's what I sort of crave more of.
I'm glad that resonated with you, because it's there's a lot of game design behind that. So that didn't come out of nowhere, right? Like, one of the things that I realized when I was putting this game together is I wanted it to. I had as a design goal an experience that took a lot of the onus off of the keeper, right? Like, the keeper doesn't have to do everything, right? And because in a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, one of the criticisms is the keeper often has to think of things, or the MC has to think of things on the fly, and it can be a little challenging, right? And so the way our games work, as you experienced in the Between, is when you're getting ready to do what's called the day or the night move, you have to say as a player what you're afraid is going to happen if you fail, or if you're facing something scary if you lose your nerve, right? And that's a really great moment at the table, because it does a few things. One, it does take the burden off the keeper a little bit, right? But two, it also kind of allows the player to say what they're interested in, right? Like, the player gets to say, this is what I'm interested in. Like, even though I know it's bad, like, this is kind of what I want. Like, this is what I think would be scary and cool, right? And so that's pretty great. And because the player helped set the stakes of the moment, they can't really complain when it goes badly, like, they're, because they helped create the situation, right? And then the night move, that's the day move. The night move goes one step further, and like you said, the keeper says, well, here's how it's worse than that. And that moment is really terrific, because it's because at that point, everyone is like, the stakes are super high at that point. Everyone is totally locked in, and the die roll is exciting, right? It's like, okay, we know what's going to happen if this die roll goes poorly. And so, yeah, it at the table, it just comes across so great. I'm glad that resonated with you, because it is it's one of the several things that the Between does that I really love.
Oh, there are so many things that the Between does that I love. For example, the unseen. I can go on and on about the unseen, but I want to know from your perspective, where did it materialize in your mind? How did you come up with that? Because I haven't seen something like that ever. And also,
there's nothing like it. Yeah.
Before you answer that, what are you afraid will happen when this goes wrong and it's worse than that? I'm yoinking it for my games.
Yeah. And also, for the listeners and for myself, could you just explain what the unseen is?
Yeah, that's what I was getting to. How it came to you, and what was?
Well, so the unseen. We'll say what it is. Yeah. So the unseen. So in this game, the game is divided into phases of play. There's the day phase, the night phase, the two main phases of play in the Between. And in the day phase, your Victorian era monster hunters they're doing the investigations. They're kind of like trying to learn about these ghosts and vampires and stuff that are terrorizing the city, serial killers, right? They're trying to investigate these things so that they can stop them. And in the day phase, it's more wide open. It's kind of languid. It's sort of the players can kind of do whatever they want to do. But in the night phase, it's much more feral and much more compressed, right? Like you don't have as much time. And one of the things that happens during the night phase is while the hunters are, doing whatever they're doing to hunt down monsters, in another part of the city, there's another scene going on at the exact same time, that same night. And that scene has nothing to do with the story that you're telling with the hunters. Like they have no connection to each other, at least directly. But what it's doing is it's sort of showing London as its own character in the story, essentially, right? So while the hunters are, hunting down a vampire, the unseen, which we're narrating in between those scenes, the unseen might be about, it might be about a performance at a theater, or it might be about a, something taking place at a hospital or a mortuary,
or a market,
yeah, exactly. Like it's. And the idea is you bounce back and forth between the unseen and the hunter scenes. And when the unseen is finished, that's when the night phase is over, right? But you bounce back and forth. And even though those two scenes have nothing to do with each other, they're not connected directly, they can connect up thematically or visually, right? So something that's going on in the unseen might be reflective of something going on in the hunter scenes. And so you get this almost like cinematic echoing between the two, right? And if you do that, if you kind of create those echoes, you get experience points at the end of the session, right? You're kind of incentivized to do that. And there's nothing, you're right, there's nothing like it in role-playing games. It is, except for other Carved from Brindlewood games, there's really nothing like it. It's a unique thing. And it has the effect of, and the reason why I made it, it has the effect of making London a character in the story, in the same way that the hunters are characters, and the place they live, Hargrave House, is a character. The city of London is also a character, and the unseen is sort of how that is expressed. And it's when you have a group that is, after a few sessions, the group's really got the hang of it. It's magic. It is magic to be doing whatever your characters are doing and showing this person dying of consumption somewhere else in the city. And then you start to have these interesting thematic connections between, like this idea of like death and consumption. And maybe that's kind of weaving into the hunter scenes. And it just, it can be so visual. It can be so thematic. It can operate on a subconscious level. Like sometimes things are happening in the unseen that reflect the hunter scenes, and you don't even realize it, right? You're just doing it, right? Because your mind is filling in the gaps or whatever. You really have to experience it. It's one of the things that makes the game very, very special. And it all kind of goes back to a bigger design goal I had for the Between, which is I do want the Between, as much as possible, to feel like a cinematic experience. Like I really want the pacing and the descriptive qualities and the visuals and the way you tell the story to feel like you're watching a TV show or a movie, right? And the unseen really helps with that.
Yeah, it invites the players to build the world as well. But
exactly.
what if someone doesn't know about London or has no exposure to British culture?
I can't say for sure that I know how that would go. I mean, I mostly play with Americans, and they don't necessarily know anything about English or British culture.
Fair.
But that said, my sense is that the prompts with the unseen are pretty leading, right? Like they give you a lot of information in them, and so you're not really creating things completely out of whole cloth. You're given a lot of like guidance. It's a pretty guided sort of thing, and I haven't found that players have really had any trouble with it. So. And also, worth pointing out, the Between says at the very beginning when you start playing, it's okay if you don't know the history of Victorian era London. Like that's perfectly fine. Like it's okay if we get this wrong from time to time. It's not. We're here for the vibes, not the historical accuracy. So yeah.
I once tried to run a D&D mini campaign set in Victorian era London, a whole murder mystery with all different kinds of D&D races just living together in London.
That sounds great to me. I love it.
So the queen is an elf, because she doesn't. She seems to be aging all the time. The joke back when she was there. And yeah, I hope I really don't get cancelled over this one. And yes, there are a few other things that I took from this movie Zootopia, and a few more ideas that I got from multiple sources. But this one sounds really intriguing. I really want to try the Between at this point.
If you do, I think what you're going to love about the Between is this is a game that like is going to ask a lot of you and the players. It's going to ask a lot of the keeper. It's going to ask a lot of the players. Like it really, really like there's an expectation that as a player, you are going to help build this world. You are going to help tell this story. You're going to be responsible for your character, but you're also going to be responsible for the world building. It's not all the keeper's job. But it's going to do it in a way that provides a really nice structure. There's a structure there so that you can do it and feel confident in what you're doing as a group. And the outcome is magic. So that's without putting too much of a. I mean, I know I'm biased, but I happen to believe it's true. So.
So I played a few games, that are powered by the apocalypse. I think Masks is one of them, and then I think there's Vaesen or Wyson. I don't know how that's pronounced. And also, I think Candela Obscura is powered by the apocalypse, right?
It's like Forge in the Dark-ish. Yeah. But Forge in the Dark is also, but I would say Forge in the Dark.
So in that case, Vaesen is also Forge in the Dark itself. It's very similar to Candela.
It is, yeah. I mean, Forge in the Dark, I consider to be an offshoot of PBTA in the same way that Carve from Brindlewood is an offshoot of PBTA, and the way that Trophy is an offshoot of PBTA. Like PBTA kind of spun off its own. Like people have kind of made their own little systems from PBTA.
So my question here is, the D20 system is quite famous around in the TTRPG space just because of D&D or Pathfinder or anything. So what actually led you to select PBTA as your base system? Because yes, both of them are they've been there for years now. But what is the main difference in the gameplay that causes you to select these things?
At a basic level, I mean, there's probably a lot of things going on, but the biggest difference to me is that it's about granularity. So in a D20 game, you pick up the dice a lot in order to do much, much smaller pieces of fiction. So you're going to roll the dice every time you swing your sword. You're going to roll the dice every time you try to get into this place or do this thing. And so
you roll a die to open a door.
Yeah, exactly. You're like, that's exactly right. Whereas in a PBTA game, it kind of operates at a higher level. Whenever you roll the dice, it's like a whole scene. So I'm not just rolling a dice to hit this guy. I'm rolling dice to see whether I can defeat him outright, right? And then based on the die rolls, this is not true in every case, but generally speaking, the die rolls, there's like 3 levels of outcome. They're either a success, there's a mixed result or like a partial success, or there's a miss. And so a success, which would be a 10 plus, you as the player can narrate what happens. Like, okay, I rolled the dice, I got a success, I get to defeat this guy, and now I'm going to tell you what that looks like. So rather than like rolling for every swing of the fist, you just narrate how you defeat the guy.
So right? It feels a little more cinematic at that point.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The mid result. Oh, sorry. Good. I'll keep going through it. The mid result is like success, but complication. So you're going to defeat, and that's a 7 to 9. You're going to defeat the guy, but he's going to also like break your jaw, right? So you narrate how you defeat the guy, but also he smashes your jaw, and now you have a busted jaw to deal with, right? And then a miss can be lots of different types of outcomes depending on the move, but kind of generally it means you fail and it doesn't go the way you wanted. And furthermore, things get worse. The guy doesn't just like defeat you, but like something even worse happens because of it. And so that's kind of the basic thing. But to me, there's a lot of differences between them, but the biggest one is granularity, basically. PBTA games, the dice cover a lot more fiction, essentially.
So, what is the purpose and mechanic behind the Janus mask?
Yes, yeah. So one of the things that is also kind of unique about the Between is you are not allowed, either in or out of character, to talk about your character's past. So you make your character. We all know some basics about the character, but we don't know anything about their backstory. You are not allowed to talk about it until the game says you can talk about it, right? And one of the ways that you can talk about it is through this aspect of the character sheet called the Janus mask. And in particular, there's a part of the Janus mask called the Mask of the Past. So the way it works, and this is kind of connects up nicely with this idea of the die rolls handling a lot of fiction, right? I roll dice, we have that conversation. What are you scared of? Here's how it's worse. And Wes is the keeper, and Wes tells me, well, here's how it's worse. You're not just going to get injured. You're going to get disemboweled. Okay. So I roll my dice and I get a 5, which is bad. And Wes then narrates the killer disemboweling my character, narrates it fully. We narrate the guts spilling everywhere and my character dead, right? Well, in the Between, what I can then say is, well, you know what? I'm going to use the Janus mask. And so I would mark a box on the Mask of the Past, or there's also one called the Mask of the Future. But for purposes of this, I'm going to say the Mask of the Past. And I do what it says. And usually what it says is narrate a flashback telling us X, Y, Z. So here I get to tell you a little bit about my character's past. And once I do that, in exchange for doing that, I get to revisit that bad die roll and make it a 7 instead of a 5. And so now I don't get disemboweled. And so we narrate something different in that scene. And that's basically how it works. There are no hit points in the Between. Your characters they can acquire conditions, but they're otherwise alive or dead, right? And but you do have these masks, and these masks are kind of like your hit points, because once they're all gone, then you have to take the result of your die rolls, and that normally happens at the end of the campaign. Like you usually have enough masks to last you, the whole campaign. But yeah, that's basically it. Like, it's this idea of we get to see your character's past in flashback at a dramatically interesting time. That interesting time in my example being when my character almost got disemboweled by the serial killer, right? And so that's the idea. It's a way of saving your character after a really cataclysmic bad die roll, essentially. But also it's an opportunity to tell us about your character's past. And so over the course of many sessions, you start to build up this character via flashbacks, right? You get to learn more and more about them as we play. And that, again, is very cinematic, right? Like, if you're watching a really good TV show, they don't tell you everything about the characters in the first episode, right? They certainly don't tell you everything before you even press play. And so you learn it as you go, right? And so that's how this works too. It's backstory as a mechanic. You got it. Yeah.
So what are some of the archetypes present in the Between? For example, the Undeniable.
Very powerful, yeah. Especially at the Undeniable. Just so listeners know, the Undeniable is like a Dorian Gray style. Like, they're this like very magnetic, beautiful person, and the reason why they're that way is because there's an artwork somewhere hidden in the city that takes on all their that physically takes on all their sins and their corruption, so that they can stay pristine, and they're very powerful. They have this like, they're so beautiful that like people just obey them, right? So yeah.
Do we need to watch Penny Dreadful to get a feel for the Between?
Well, and if you're interested in the Between, you really only have to watch like the first 3 episodes of Penny Dreadful, because that kind of gives you the whole thing. like this is like, you watch those first couple of episodes and it's like, okay, I get the Between. Like, I totally get what this is about. So yeah.
What I'm getting is that these aren't relaxing sessions to enjoy on a Sunday morning.
Yeah. I fess up to my games like want your attention. They demand your full attention. Yeah, in a good way. Yeah. This is Brindlewood Bay, the Between, public access. You don't get to You don't get to like sit and be the passive player in those games. What they really do is they create like a permission structure for people who feel like they can't do that, right? Like a lot of people feel like, oh, I just roll the dice when it's my turn, and then I watch, and that's what I'm meant to do. I think a lot of people don't realize that role playing games can be this much more active, collaborative process, right? Like it's not just the GM. It's not just the GM's job to like tell you a story, right? It's our job to tell ourselves a story, right? And so I think that our games like create this really nice permission structure and indeed mechanical structure for you to do that, and it's very exciting.
Users also went through a process for creating your own TTRPGs and everything. Do you would you want to give so for any of the budding TTRPG creators? Would you like what is the advice that you would give?
Yeah, I guess it depends on like where they're at in their process, right? If it's just like the sort of game design process, I guess my biggest tip is you don't have to create the whole game before you start playtesting it. I think that this is a trap that some people fall into where they feel like they have to have the entire game complete before they start trying it out and playtesting and seeing how it works. You only have to have the bits that you want to try out done, right? It's okay to have like a half done thing and get your friends together and say, let's try this out. You can playtest a scene, you can playtest one rule, you can or if you want to playtest the whole game, you can playtest the whole game. Like you don't have to have everything done before you start trying it out. So as soon as you have a good idea, as soon as you get some rules down in the paper, like just start seeing how it goes and then kind of work from there. Don't let completion and perfection be the enemy of good, right? Like just you're just like work on it in pieces if you have to, and I think that's totally fine. Having said that, I tend to be the type of person who doesn't write anything until it's all in my head. And then once it's all fully in my head, then I sit down and I write it really fast, but I sit and do it then. But even like when things are just kind of living in my head, I can scribble some things down enough to like say, hey, let's get together. I want to try this rule out and see if it works. And so I'll frame up a little scene and we'll kind of try out the mechanic and see how it goes. And you can do that without having to have it all done, right? So definitely don't feel like you have to have it all finished before you start trying it out and seeing if it works. That's probably like my number one tip. If you are at the stage where you are ready to start, you have your game done and you want to start, or you're nearly done and you want to start marketing it so that people play it and maybe even buy it, that's a slightly different thing. But I guess what I would say is you just have to find a way of communicating and continuing to communicate with your potential players and customers, right? So, this podcast is a great example of that, right? Like if the two of you ever decide to make a game, you have a fantastic foundation in this podcast for getting people to pay attention to what you're doing, right? And so that's what I would recommend. Like you have to just find a way of getting people's of just continuing a conversation, whether that be a Discord channel or whether that be, maybe you make YouTube videos, or maybe you have a podcast, or maybe you just, maybe it's something as simple as a newsletter or something like that. Like you just have to have a way of like, whenever you get someone's attention, just find a way to like keep talking to them in whatever way that happens to be, so that they get kind of invested in what you're doing. And so that's our superpower at the Gauntlet. We are in very, very good communication with our base of players, right? So yeah, and like if you have any interest in ever like doing this as a like doing role playing game design as a business, or like or like in the way that I do, you keep that conversation going, and you sort of you let your community into the process, right? It's like, okay, I mean, you have to have the confidence of knowing when you're right about something, right? Like I know when something is right or wrong, right? Like, and if I'll stick to my guns if I feel convinced, but I also have to have the flexibility of like, okay, everybody in my Discord server, they have played these games enough to know, like if I get like a significant amount of pushback on a certain rule or mechanic, I know it's probably good feedback, right? Because they have the experience, right? So it's a give and take. And with the Infinite Tavern, you absolutely, like keep that conversation going, keep your community engaged, keep them just have fun, right? Like that's the key. Like have fun, be a fun place always for them to show up. And whenever you decide to do something like the next thing with it, whatever that is, they'll be with you. So yeah.
And where is it that people can actually go and back the Between?
It's BackerKit is the platform we're using. Yeah, that's okay. I do it all the time. We're using BackerKit. It is going to be September 24th. That is when it goes live. There's probably going to be a link in the show notes for this where you can go to sign up to be notified when it goes live. If this is not out by then, but. Yeah, we're going to be crowdfunding 3 books. The core rule book of the Between. The Between's been out for a few years digitally, but we're going to do this physical release of the Between finally, and it's going to be slightly expanded and revised from the original version from 3 years ago. So that'll be the one book. There's a second book called Shadow Society, which is just an expansion of the London setting with new scenarios and stuff. And then the third book is called Sons of Another World, which has 3 new campaign settings for the game. Ghosts of El Paso, which takes place in El Paso, Texas, and in the 1800s. And then Unsinkable, which takes place aboard a luxury cruise liner, a transatlantic cruise liner. And then Court of Wolves, which takes place in Versailles at the time of Louis XIV. So 3 new ways to play the Between in that third book. And yeah, we've got one very special kind of limited reward that you'll only be able to get if you kind of get on it. And perhaps of particular interest to your listeners, we have mastered international shipping at the Gauntlet. We have figured it out. So we have got it sorted out to where the international shipping will not be like the same cost as the thing you're backing. We've managed to get international shipping under control. It's very, very hard, but we have spent a lot of time getting our sort of distribution network sorted out so that we can provide much more reasonable shipping costs. So really, really don't feel like, oh, I can't get involved in that because I'm in India or because I'm wherever in the world. So I think I'm really excited about Sons of Another World because what I hope is that people will say, oh, I can make playbooks for all kinds of settings. Like it doesn't have to just be London, right? Like that, like London's where it is, like where it started. But I think that would be amazing. So yeah, you should definitely, if you have any tips, I'm happy to give you feedback on that. I saw like Brindlewood Bay that took place in the Philippines, Brindlewood Bay that took place in like a Bavarian mountain, Brindlewood, like there was like so many, like people would take like Brindlewood Bay and just like reskin it for their wherever they're from, so that's pretty cool.
And can we still go and play the first edition of the Between? Is it available?
It's free. Yeah, you can. Yeah, well, it's actually the game. Like it's the game that we published 3 years ago. We call it the preview edition now, but it's a full game and it's pay what you want. So you can go check it out for free, basically. Oh, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much to Mr. Jason Cordova for being on our podcast. And until next time, may all your roles be great.